Yeah, I can just start. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Nina, for having me. And, it's good to be back. Happy holidays. It's almost time. And I do have a regular classical piano program that's like I did last time. By the way, I'm Robert Buxton. Yeah. And, I do have some holiday things I'm going to throw in, especially in the beginning right now. I'd like to improvise for you. I did something last time with improvisation. So in the early 1800s and before, classical pianists improvised all the time. That was what they did. Liszt, Chopin, Beethoven, it was normal. And for some reason in classical music we stopped today, so we don't do it. But here's what I wanted to try today. It may or may not work, and that's the thing with improvisation, is you never know what's going to happen. I'd like to take a famous holiday or Christmas or whatever melody that everybody knows. If you give me a suggestion, just something everyone knows.
White Christmas.
White Christmas, okay. Very good. So something like, Okay, but in the style of what classical composer?
Bach.
Oh, Bach is the hardest. Okay, but you asked, so. Okay. Let's try. That's the hardest one. Maybe we'll do one more because that was so nerve-wracking, like 4. So I was on 440.
Angels from the realms of glory.
I'm sorry?
Angels from the
Okay.
realms of glory.
Angels from the, so that goes, but in the style, and think what would be funny, what doesn't fit, like oil and water. What classical composer would not use a melody like that? Did you say Brahms? I heard Sanson, but is it okay? Maybe Brahms. Angels from the realms of glory. And I'm playing Brahms today, so perfect. Okay. Angels from the realms of glory in the style of Brahms. Okay. So. It's fun to do that sometimes. You never know what's going to happen. So now I'm going to play you the real program, the real music. I mean, it's not that that's not real music, but it's just a funny exercise in style. So, you know, last time I did all violin music arranged for the piano, and I'm still sort of doing this theme. I'm coming to the conclusion, to a conclusion with it. And I have to say, some of today's program, it's actually pretty heavy. So what I'll do is then at the very end, I have some other holiday things that are more light and fun. So if you find yourself thinking, this is just heavy stuff, and it is, you know, just wait a little and there'll be some. I try to have something for everyone. But I'd like to start with a piece that is frequently played on the violin, but it's originally from an opera by Gluck. And it's an opera from 1762, thereabouts, called Orpheus and Eurydice. Gluck, it's an arrangement by Scambati for solo piano. So Gluck was a composer in Vienna a bit before Mozart's time, you know, a bit before. And of course, this opera is based on the ancient Greek myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, which is a famous story. You know, Eurydice dies, she goes to the underworld, and Orpheus follows her there, wants to rescue her, bring her back to earth, and he pleads with the gods of the underworld, and he brings his lyre. I always say L-Y-R-E. It's a harp, not L-I-A-R. It's different. And Hades is so moved by his music that he says, okay, you can take her up to earth with you. She can come back to life as long as you don't look back while you're transporting her back. Fine. By the way, there's that story in the Bible, Sodom and Gomorrah, same, idea. Unfortunately, at the last moment, Orpheus looks back, and she goes back to the underworld, never to return. So the myth is a tragedy. But in the opera, this is the age of enlightenment, the age of Voltaire and Rousseau and Locke, and so we don't end things like that. In the opera, Cupid intervenes and Eurydice comes back to earth. They have a big celebration, and everybody lives happily ever after. Wonderful. Now, this melody from Orpheus and Eurydice, this melody is a lament. It's an excerpt of the Dance of the Blessed Spirits, which is not sung. It's played on the flute in the opera, accompanied by strings, and there's a sort of ballet that goes on with it. Now, this piece has been arranged and adapted for many different instruments. I mentioned violin, and there's recordings of Misha Elman, Jascha Heifetz playing this. And on the piano version, arranged by Scambati, who's such a beautiful name, Scambati, that's what I'm going to play. There's an amazing recording of this arrangement by Sergei Rachmaninoff. You can find it on YouTube. And this was the kind of piece that you would hear more typically 120 years ago on a concert program. It's not as popular now to play arrangements, and I'm sort of intrigued by that because I like things that are outdated and out of style, because maybe they'll be in style again. I don't know, but anyway. So this is Gluck, Scambati, melody from Orpheus and Eurydice. Again, it's Orpheus's lament for his wife. thing. And in a similarly sort of bleak style, like today, outside, I'm going to play one of Robert Schumann's Paganini Caprice arrangements. I think the last time I was here, I played a couple of these. This is the one that's newest for me, so I didn't do it last time. I try to keep it fresh, you know. So Robert Schumann, in the 1830s, he arranged 12 of Paganini's solo violin caprices for piano solo. He did it because he admired Paganini so much that he wanted to learn as much as he could from Paganini by, let's say, translating him from violin to piano. Like a painter would go to a museum and copy a master and learn about themselves in doing that. That's what Schumann was doing. So there's 12 of them that Schumann did, but there's 24 caprices. And I wonder about that. Did he intend to do all 24 and he stopped? I'm not really sure. But what I do notice is that over the course of these studies, they're called studies or etudes, they sound, like the first few, they sound very close to the original Paganini. And then by the time you're at like this one, number 8 or 9, I forget the number, you don't hear Paganini that much. You don't hear the style of Paganini. You hear the style of Schumann. And it's interesting that Schumann did these very early on. And it was after these arrangements he wrote his masterpieces. Carnival, David's Bundeltanze, Kindersehnden, you know, all of his piano solo cycles. So it's almost as if he had devoured Paganini in these arrangements, and in doing so, he became Schumann. That's how I look at it. Schumann had a very difficult life. He had bipolar disorder, and at the time, they didn't really know what that was, or they didn't have the treatments for it that they have now, obviously. So he suffered quite a bit during his life, and I would say that in his music, there's this tragic sense, especially in this piece. You know, when I hear this on the solo violin, the Paganini version, it just sounds sunnier. It's different. You know, in this musical translation by Schumann, it's a completely different piece on the piano. So Schumann was interesting because at one point he wanted to become a novelist at a young age. And he was very influenced by writers like E.T.A. Hoffmann, who wrote these fantasy-like novellas, actually. They would have splices in their plot, almost like a movie where you have one action scene and then splice something else, splice something else. You know, Schumann created a whole set of literary characters, and he would include this in his writings, most of which were music criticism. But they weren't the kind of music criticism you might read today in, I don't know, the Guardian or the New York Times or something. It was more a literary music criticism through the voices of these characters. So it was literary, you know. And actually one of the characters was Paganini in this, you know, group of, he called them the Davidsbündler, the League of David, named after, you know, the biblical League of David. So, but the two main characters were Florestan and Eusebius. And here's what they were for him. Florestan was his manic side, quite frankly. Oh, Gesundheit, bless you. That, and then, you know, Eusebius was his depressive side. And Schumann would write in his music sometimes which character was the piece. And so if we think along those terms, this one that I'm going to play you is definitely Eusebius, mostly. Now here's one thing I mentioned about the splicing. This is a criticism Schumann gets sometimes. Sometimes people say, you know, Schumann didn't really know how to develop an idea. I heard another criticism that said Schumann's music, it's like shish kebab, you know, it's like what piece of this, a piece of that, something. By the way, shish kebab is great, don't you think? And I think, well, that's the point. That's the point. It doesn't need to be, it's not one unified thing. We have a bunch of different things and they may not relate. And if you read E.T.A. Hoffmann or Jean-Paul Richter, the writers of that time that Schumann loved, that's how they write. So this piece is like that. It starts out with this mournful thing. You know, It's so mournful. And then just out of the blue, there's a march, you know. That's Schumann, those sudden changes of character. So here is one of Schumann's Paganini arrangements. Thank you. Now I'm going to play Brahms. This is the second book of his Paganini variations. Last time I was here, I did book 1. So, the sequel, you know. This is also, it's not easy listening, necessarily. It's not, but there's so much depth and there's so much soul in this music if you know, let it get on its wavelength. So it's you know, I admit that. So Brahms walked, you know, up to the Schumann's door as a young man seeking advice, and he knocked on the door. He had some of his early compositions with him, and they pretty much, Clara and Robert. Clara, you know, was a great musician herself, composer and pianist. They said, just live with us for a while. They sort of adopted him, and he was just living there. Now, unfortunately, not so long after, Robert Schumann's mental and physical health took a turn for the worse. He tried to jump into the icy Rhine River, and he was institutionalized and died at the age of like 47 or something. It's a tragedy to think of that. And Brahms was helping Clara all this time. Clara was pregnant with their 7th child at this time. So that's the circumstances we're talking about. Now, there is a sort of a rumor, and it really is a bit of a myth, that there was a love triangle between Brahms, Clara Schumann, who was 20 years older than him, 19 years, and Robert. And from what I read from historians, this has all been overblown. There's a movie from the 40s with Katharine Hepburn playing Clara Schumann, and you know, it's about this, because it makes for good Hollywood, just like the story of Amadeus makes for some good Hollywood. You know, the movie, it's a great movie, historically completely inaccurate. You know, Salieri, they hardly knew each other. Salieri didn't poison him. Actually, Salieri's a great composer. I listened to one of his operas in the car the other day, and great. So that's a similar, you know, idea. But there definitely was this unspoken, unrequited love going on there. Clara and Brahms, they wrote these letters to each other for the rest of their lives. And you can sense that there's something there. And in a way, that's even more powerful to me than the Hollywood way, you know? Brahms was kind of a loner throughout his life. He had this devotion to Clara and this connection to her. You know, he would send all his music to her for critique, and she would give him advice, what to change and things. By the way, she called these Paganini variations, she called them dreadful witches variations. She didn't like them very much, so that's, and they're really tricky to play, my goodness. So, but I feel, even in this music, there's a lot of nostalgia and melancholy, and it's maybe wrapped up with his feelings towards Clara. He wrote this in 1862-63, so after he had lived in the Schumann's home. This was a bit after, but he was still a young man when he wrote this, 29, 30 years old. What Brahms is doing here, he takes the 24th Caprice by Paganini and just obsessively does variations on them. It's not an arrangement like the last two I did. It's his own composition based on that. And he did 2 whole books of them. You know, he was that obsessed with the idea. And, you know, after a few variations, I don't hear Paganini anymore. It's just purely Brahms and his unique style. And Brahms, I call him a prickly pear, because he was, on the one hand, he was from a northern city, Hamburg, you know, very cold and rainy. It's like this all the time, even in August, you know. I was in Munich in the summer, and it was like this, a little warmer, but it was not much. So, so Brahms, his music, it's like Schumann. It's hard to get into, I think. But once you do, there's so much warmth and depth there that it's like a prickly pear in that sense. Brahms, I also think that he, living in Vienna, he absorbed a lot of Slavic influence. Because if you look at a map, Vienna is further east than Prague. And Vienna has always been, and is today, a very diverse place. It was Austro-Hungary at the time. And so he was, Brahms being from Hamburg, but he absorbed all this other music, Hungarian gypsy music. You know, why did he write the Hungarian dances? You know. For such a serious guy, that's pretty fun. finally, I'll just say, maybe I mentioned this last time about Brahms's physical looking, which was so different from his younger years to his older years. Like if you try to picture Brahms in your mind, what do you imagine? A Santa Claus beard, a cigar, a bigger guy? That was him in his later years. I read he couldn't even grow a beard until he was in his 40s. So when he showed up at the Schumann's home, he was this angelic looking kid. I mean, he just looked like a different person. And I was going through, over the summer, we were driving through South Carolina, and I saw a guy at a rest area on a Harley Davidson. He looked exactly like Brahms, with the beard and everything. And I told my wife, I'm gonna go tell him, it's extraordinary. And before I knew it, I felt she was pulling on my, don't you get, you might not get the reaction you're expecting. So here's book 2 of the Paganini variations. Brahms wrote these as finger exercises originally, but he liked how they sounded, so he decided they'd be a concert piece. But they still are, I call them finger torture, they still are sort of in the form of exercises for the fingers, so here it is. Thank you. I told you it's heavy stuff. And it's heavy to play, and this, by the way, sometimes, that wasn't me. Sometimes I heard this note. It sounds like a wrong note. Not that I didn't hit wrong note. You know, I think that in Brahms, Paganini, it's impossible to hit all the right notes. I'm not trying to excuse myself, but it's so awkward to play, it's so difficult and tricky and awkward. You know, there's some music that's difficult, but it fits your hands and then you sort of get used to it. There's no getting used to this. It's just, and I've listened to some of my favorite pianists, Richter and others, play this, and I have to admit, I was a little bit comforted to also hear that sometimes they'll hit a clunker here and there. Now speaking of clunkers, this piece, I don't even know if I should do it. It might really clear out the room. It's very hard to listen to. And then I promise I will play you some lighter Christmas things after this. But this is a piece from 1941 by Ludosławski, Polish composer. And it's quite modernistic, you know. You've seen abstract paintings, you know what I'm talking about. The question is, how comfortable are you with things like this? You're gonna hear it. But I think that when you're dealing with this kind of music, it's like abstract music, you could call it that. It really helps to know the context of it. There's a reason why the music sounded like that. And sure, it's not pretty or maybe even pleasant. And it wouldn't be the music I would necessarily always want to listen to in the car. Sometimes it is. But there's a reason for that. That was their goal. They didn't want to write Brahmsian, Schumann-esque music. Because, let's be honest, the 20th century had so much horror in it. Now, Ludosławski, or I think in Polish it's pronounced Ludosławski, he was an officer in the Polish army. And this was at the point, I think, that the Nazis were here and the Soviets were here, and it was certain death for him. And actually his brother was captured, I think by the Soviets, but may have been the Nazis. I'm not, either one, probably the Nazis, and he never saw him again, he died. And at a certain point, the Polish army dissolved in this chaos. And of course, the Nazis, you know, then became enemies with the Soviets. Remember, there was that period when the Soviets and the Nazis were sort of allied, and then that ended, you know, when they invaded Poland, the Nazis. So Ludosławski just sort of walked back from the front. He walked back to Warsaw. Now, I have to point out, all of this story would have been very different had he been Jewish, because, you know, the tragedy of Polish Jews, it's unspeakable. What happened. You know, watch the movie The Pianist, about a famous Polish Jewish pianist, Władysław Szpilman, explains, or it portrays what that was like. So, but Ludosławski, I just call him Ludosławski, he got back to Warsaw, and there was no money, no food, you know, he was struggling, and so he actually, to make some money, he started doing these concerts at bars, mostly two pianos, with a friend of his, fellow composer, Andrzej Panufnik, who also later became a great avant-garde Polish composer. Actually, he eventually lived in London, England, so Panufnik. And a lot of these concerts, they would play popular music. They would arrange some American jazz or some things. But a lot of the concerts, too, were compositions that they wrote. And some of them pretty dissonant, like this one. And definitely not legal with the Nazis. You know, any kind of abstract art or music for the Nazis, and actually later the Soviets, when they, you know, took over Poland after the war, completely banned. That's why you've heard of Shostakovich constantly butting heads with the Soviet authorities over his music. So yeah, that was what was going on. And I'll tell you a story about that. Ludosławski and Panufnik were giving a concert one evening at a bar in Warsaw. This was during the war, of course. And the SS walked in. And they said, stop. And they took out their pistols and put it right at their temples and said, this concert is illegal. You're going to be shot right now. We're going to kill you right now. The owner of the restaurant or the bar came out and said, no, don't do it. These are my employees. They weren't, you know. Please they're just doing their job. This concert is approved. And the SS said, okay then, and they just walked off. That's what the circumstances were like when this piece was written. And then at a certain point, Warsaw fell, and Ludosławski had to like everyone else, had to get out as fast as he could. And he basically could only carry a few things. And from this period, he only brought one composition of this piece, the Variations on a Theme by Paganini. That's it. All the other things he wrote during this period were burned, were destroyed. So that's the context. That's why the music is going to sound like this, because how could you write a pretty melody under such circumstances? You know, that's what Theodor Adorno said about Schoenberg, and Adorno was a philosopher about music and other things. And he said that after the horrors of the Second World War, how could you write something like that? You know, so that, I think that gives some context. By the way, there's another piece that I recommend. If you're struggling with this 20th century style, and I get it, you know, it's not easy, it's thorny and abrasive. There is an incredible piece called A Survivor from Warsaw by Arnold Schoenberg. And it has narration. And that narration, along with the music, really illustrates what the music is conveying. So that's just something to listen to if you have a chance. That's a very powerful piece of music and narration. So anyway, this is Ludosławski's Paganini Variations. I'm telling you, after this, I'm going to play you some light things, you know, I promise. So, but this is really, it's not easy listening. It's not easy playing too. So this is my arrangement of it, because the original piece is for 2 pianos. Then in 1978, he rewrote it for piano and orchestra, and I've tried to make it into a 1-piano version, and it's really hard, so also forgive me if it is just, but it's that same Paganini. It's that same 24th Caprice that Brahms used. And that's just, to me, it's fascinating how in this completely different style, Ludosławski does it. So, okay, good luck to you and me. I warned you, so, yeah. Well, I told you about the context of it, and can you imagine feeling like that? I mean, I think that's what it is. And learning it, I felt like I was losing it. And then I realized at a certain point, the way I feel learning it is only a fraction of what he felt at that time and that context writing it. So as promised, we're going to shift gears, and I'm going to play you a stride piano version of Santa Claus is Coming to Town. Here it is. This is inspired by Dave Brubeck, so. Thank you. And I love to play old gospel music, and there's a reason for that. So I post a lot of things online. If you're a YouTuber, you can find, and a lot of the stuff you might see if you look me up is a lot of gospel. And people ask me, so I don't get it. What's what you play like Ludoslavsky and Rachmaninoff, and then where's the gospel? How does that all fit in? Here's how it fits in. Maybe I told you last. So I grew up in New Jersey with two immigrant parents. My mother is an immigrant from the Soviet Union. She came in 1980 to this country, and it's through her I got this love of classical music. My dad's also an immigrant from the southern part of Virginia, and he raised me with all this old-time gospel music at the same time. So that's the explanation. Here is one of the great spirituals, Go Tell It on the Mountain. It's for Christmas. Yeah, and there is a great novel by James Baldwin with that title from the 1950s. That's a powerful book. It is autobiographical, called Go Tell It on the Mountain. So here it is. we can wrap up here unless you got more Christmas music. Yeah, I think this will be good. Thank you for coming. We had like everything from, I don't even know what. It was a mix of many things, oddly. And I hope that it was okay to mix so many strange things. But have a wonderful holiday season, and would love to see you soon. So, take care. Yes.
How old were you when you realized or discovered that you were so talented and a genius?
When did I realize I had talent?
Yeah.
Never. It's just hard.